Cool. So, have kind of, pretty roughly titled this Building Just Post-Carbon Futures, Rare Earths and Material Commons in the Energy Transition. I am going to talk a little bit about lithium, but I'm going to talk much more about the kind of full suite of rare earth elements, critical minerals, transition metals, these terms that get used kind of interchangeably and are related but different. Um, and their supply chains, their supply matrix, the places they come from, where they go, and all those sorts of things that implicate lithium, but are perhaps a bit bigger of a frame in terms of the material that we're interested in. And this is tied to a couple different books that are, one of which is almost done, one of which is just getting started, that I'll talk some more about as I kind of get going. So, I mean, of the many reasons I think, really excited to see the symposium come together, and also really, I think, honored and excited to get asked to be part of it, is because this exact framework that you all have set out here is precisely how I think about internationalism and climate justice kind of bound up together in the energy transition. And so this is an image from a project a bunch of students and I worked on over the course of about 3 years here, called a field guide towards an internationalist Green New Deal, or field notes towards an internationalist Green New Deal, which is looking at some of these key bits of technology, lithium-ion batteries, solar photovoltaics, super magnets, which are the things you need to make data centers work, and their material ecology, essentially, which again is kind of the focus of this event. And did that for a few reasons I'll kind of get to, and we can talk some more about at the end of this. But the two big ones were, one, that we had done a bunch of domestic work in this sort of area, and pretty rightfully had a cadre of international students and colleagues who were asking why not the rest of the world. What happens in the US obviously has profound impacts to the rest of the world in a number of ways, especially in resource communities. The other is that we really wanted to push back on this myth that mining and extraction in this industry are relatively minor concerns, which is often the line you get from eco-modernists when you talk about wanting to attend to these complications of the energy transition. So the way we sort of frame it in there is thinking less about supply chains and more about supply matrices. So as a conceptual and managerial tool, the supply chain as we understand it today emerged in the 1990s and remains the foremost method for thinking about the movement of materials, labor, products, and other commodities. But supply chains only appear to work as well as they do because of strategic gaps in our knowledge about them and how they work. These gaps show that this way of imagining and managing supply chains bears little resemblance to its actually existing forms. And that what we mean by this is there's just a lot of slippage, a lot of unknown, and a lot of uncertainty in every aspect, in the labor, the material, the economy of the supply chain. And we tend to lean on the matrix as a more useful metaphor for thinking about it. That work, in a way, comes from Thea, who I'm sure you've talked about over the course of this symposium, Thea Riofrancos, who political scientist in Providence. I'm lucky to get to do a bunch of work with, but her project is really built around lithium extraction and mining and processing and deployment through technology around the world. That work's evolved from thinking about Chile and the Atacama to now including a bunch of other sites that are in conversation with it, some in Nevada, some in Portugal, others around the world. And Thea's work here has been really important to my understanding of this body of knowledge, in helping me understand why this rush to onshore the supply chain in the US and Europe is happening. Which is a bit counterintuitive for a couple of reasons. But Thea here, I think, helps us understand a bit more about it, writing that the political economy of lithium is marked by two striking developments. One, global North governments that have historically offshored mining are now onshoring lithium to enhance their supply chain security. So this is a product of two things, COVID and supply chain issues that emerged from it, but also the sort of simmering Cold War with China that the US is stoking. Second, these governments have committed to sustainably sourced lithium, whatever that means. The mining imperative appears to pose a zero-sum choice between decarbonization and the protection of ecosystems and communities. However, lithium supply is not an objective parameter, but a spatially and temporally dynamic relationship between deposits, scientific knowledge, technological innovations, and public policy. Demand, likewise, is contingent on myriad factors that determine the resource intensivity of our energy transition. And this bit of work, it was sort of fed into a larger process, a larger bit of research at the Climate and Community Project that Thea led for us, which is also, this is probably a report you've talked about, you've seen throughout the course of this symposium, because this is maybe my favorite thing I've ever been a part of that we've put out here, but was really organized around the idea that we're asking all of the wrong questions when it comes to the realization or the implementation of the energy transition and the actualization of climate justice in the built environment. So far, that conversation has tended to be organized around questions of how much of these critical minerals or rare earth elements exist in the Earth's crust, and then how do we go about extracting every single molecule of them. It's a supply-side approach to developing the energy transition across the supply chain. We wanted, and Thea especially wanted, to ask questions around demand, namely, how much lithium or cobalt or neodymium or so on do we actually need? And how does that volume change if we think about a few different scenarios or pathways to a post-carbon future? In this case, we wanted to look at how demand for lithium might shift if we reorganized our public transportation systems in the US around transit or mass transit, instead of the sort of ongoing plan, which is to replace every existing personal vehicle, which is, combustion engine vehicle, with an electric car. So 280 million of those on the road by 2050. A lot more lithium than if we were to do some mode shifting in transportation. This is probably not a surprise. Again, this is something I'm sure you've talked about the last few weeks in here, but this is what the Joe Biden administration is sort of laser-like focused on. It's not carbon emissions per se, it is the mining sector and building it up within and beyond the US. So lots of things here I could say about this, but just to pull forward from one of the memos that these images come from, a total of $92 billion has been invested in the US battery supply chain since Biden took office in January 2021. One of those investments is via an Israel-based specialty minerals company, ICL's LFP cathode material plant in St. Louis, Missouri, which was re-reported in a few other markets afterwards. There's a $400 million project that's half funded by a grant from the federal government through the infrastructure bill, with another $2.8 billion coming through other legislation through the IRA and via the Department of Energy, all of which is going into the Rolite Ridge project in Esmeralda County, Nevada, and some of the processing facilities that are now being developed in Texas and other parts of the US. And this matters a great deal for lots of reasons, this onshoring effort, because historically these supply chains have relied on remote mining and resource communities, intentionally left underdeveloped, often by their colonial powers, in order to make the logistics of intervention more complicated, if not impossible. And by that, I mean that remoteness in places like the Atacama, in places like South Greenland, in places like Bonobo, creates a set of conditions that imperial powers and colonizers can exploit. They're free there from the scrutiny of media and NGOs. They are operating in logistically complex sites that require significant time and money just to access. And they're often doing so under the protection of paramilitary forces that can and often do just about anything they want within these places. This work is featured pretty prominently in this exhibition that some colleagues here organized a couple of weeks ago and is now, I think, due to do a little bit of traveling. This is a grant, part of a grant project that I was on with some media studies and communication scholars. Some of who you might know, Ingrid Burrington, who's at Delaware with Julie Klinger now, and lots of other folks. But this is basically about this supply matrix of the energy transition, the sites of extraction, of stockpiling and refining, of end-use deployment, and of discard or waste. And the way that exhibition is framed is that it tries to draw connections between the four primary sites or four categories of sites that underpin this larger research of the digital and energy transition. And have some student work in there from last year. A bunch of architecture students at Yale have their work in there. But I wanted to bring that up just because I think all of this work is indebted to several people. Thea is one of them who I've mentioned. Another here is Jane Ma Hutton, I think, who wrote one of, if not the most important books in landscape architecture of the last 20 or so years, called Reciprocal Landscapes. And among many other things, I think Jane gives us a really compelling way to see the energy transition, even though she's writing more about conventional landscape projects like Central Park. She writes, "The word reciprocal is not intended to soften, conceal, or suggest equanimity between sites of production and consumption. Rather, it's used in an aspirational sense, that when joined with landscape, it suggests the inextricable interdependencies that humans share with the more than non-human world, that consumers share with producers, and that all beings share with each other. To do so challenges understandings of materials as inert, and this alone is an important starting point for seeing materials as more than just stuff to use. And, at least for me, there's no real path to understanding this process without the work of Jane and the idea that there are many somewheres and someones and sometimes bound up in the materials that compose our built environment. And that to produce, truly just or sustainable design, we have to attend to those other places and peoples and times as much as we can tend to our commissions themselves. Another person who's, I think, been incredibly, important to this work is Martin Arboleda, whose intervention really helps us understand the globe through the eyes of an industrial mining operator. I'll pull another quote forward in a second here, but he also writes that the dispersed fragment of the planetary mine are therefore dialectically bound up to the pipes and cables tucked into the high-rise buildings of the mega cities that have sprung out of nowhere in South China in just 20 years. In the myriad electronic gadgets spawned by vertically integrated electronics manufacturing systems that have led to factories in Shenzhen employing up to 420,000 workers, a figure no automobile factory in the heyday of Fordism would ever have dreamed of, and in the holds of containers of the thousands of cargo vessels that make up the maritime commercial fleets of China, Japan, and South Korea, which have rendered the Pacific Ocean into the main infrastructural corridor of world trade. And to go a little further, he goes on to say that mines that have been abandoned are now being reopened, that deposits deemed uneconomical are being transformed into large open cast or open pit extraction sites that are almost fully automated. The planetary mine is the geography of extraction that emerges as the most genuine product of two distinct transformations. One is a new geography of late industrialization that is no longer tied to the traditional core of global capitalism in the West. And a second is a quantum leap in the roboticization and computerization of the labor process. So all of the same sorts of labor-breaking technological innovations we've seen in the automobile industry have also come to mining and many others. They're coming to architecture as well. And this is all happening, as the Biden administration is making this push, not to replace global South mining, but to add to its footprint. So all of the mines that we've talked about, and I'm sure you've talked about, or again, over the course of this symposium, whether we're talking about cobalt in the Congo, or we're talking about lithium in Chile, or we're talking about neodymium and praseodymium in South Greenland, the Biden administration is not interested in shutting or slowing any of that down. They're interested in adding to that supply by building and developing new projects in the US and Canada that are easier for them to control and to access. This is also true in the EU. And in 30 years, I'm at this point quite confident we won't talk about the Biden presidency as one that had anything really to do with climate or infrastructure, or even bridging generations. We'll talk about it as the single most important presidency to the mining industry in 100 years. Part of that, if I can get this to go here. Part of that is because of a desire to compete with sites like this. This is Bayan Obo in Inner Mongolia, China. And part of the positioning of the Biden administration beyond supply chain security is stoking this Cold War with China. They're interested in doing that through the energy transition because at the moment, this site, Bayan Obo, is where anywhere between 70 and 80% or so of all rare earth extraction and processing happens on the planet. This is the bottleneck for global supply of rare earths, including lithium and others. One of the Biden administration goals is to build enough of this kind of capacity in the US that we can take half or more of that market share in the next 15 years. And in that regard, we're well on the way because these new facilities are breaking ground in Texas and throughout the Southwest now, often in the billions or tens of billions of dollars in terms of capital investment. That bit of extraction work is happening as others within the administration and outside of it. In this case, this is a part of a report from Jesse Jenkins at Princeton that I'm sure folks who are familiar with, which is beginning to lay out scenarios for building the using the end use technology. So the solar panels, the transmission corridors, the battery farms, and so on of the energy transition, and trying to think through where from a land use optimization perspective, they make the most sense to build. This is one of the scenarios they've developed that's now become the playbook for the Biden administration as they start handing out grants and federal funding and through finance and other instruments to build some of this either transmission capacity or generation capacity or storage capacity. And that as we think about extraction, one of the arguments that often gets levied against it, which is not particularly true, but nevertheless it persists, is that it's not particularly land intensive. It's a small operation, minimal sort of impacts on the environment. We know that's not true, but that's one of the lines that gets thrown back at us when we talk about wanting to limit extraction to the amount we need versus the amount we know is there. But that's just on the extraction side. This is just the image you're looking at on the land use transformation, or in this case, the generation capacity on the deployment side. And in the next image here, what you're looking at is the volume of land area in the US, in each state, under a relatively conservative renewable energy development plan that will have to be transformed for energy production by 2050. So this isn't storage, this isn't transmission, this isn't extraction, this isn't waste disposal, this isn't manufacturing. This is just where the solar panel is going to go, where's the carbon capture or carbon dioxide removal technology going to go, where are the transmission lines going to go, and how much of the countries or each state's land area do we need for those things, and what kind of land will be converted as a result. And you can look at some of the hotspots there. Missouri jumps kind of off the map. Texas jumps off the page. Iowa, Illinois, some of the other Midwestern states jump off the page. This is if you're in one of these places or care about one of these places, this is the plan that the Biden administration is now putting into action, is to instrumentalize the landscape of these places for renewable energy production, which is a good thing in general, but also comes with a whole host of other challenges, given that these projects will have to be approved by, implemented by local governments. And the number one bottleneck to building this kind of generation and storage capacity in the US is local land use conflicts. So basically NIMBYism, folks who don't want to look at wind farms or battery farms or solar panels, which is actually a pretty important design challenge. And this rush to onshore, again, isn't about displacing extraction or production. It's about expanding it, re-instrumentalizing the globe for energy production, a move that will make the monitoring of sites like this in the Congo, in the global south, and other resource frontiers even more difficult than it already is. And of course, we should know what some of the more historically complicated examples of this in the US have looked like, right? It's not that we'll be doing extraction work on Long Island. We will be doing it in places like this. This is a shot from an erstwhile uranium mine on Navajo land in the Southwest. Long and very tortured history of the U.S. using this preservation land and public land as sites of extraction and waste disposal. You can still go through parts of the Southwest here in the U.S. and find rivers that are not permissible to even go near, let alone enter or drink or catch fish from because of uranium tailings. These are the kinds of sites where this extraction in the U.S. will begin once again. It's not going to be on valuable land. It's going to be on marginal land like reservation and public land in the Southwest. And of course, this is, again, looking not just at the mine, but at the network of sites that are bound up in it. Some of these, again, looking at tailings ponds and accidents. One here, again, a Navajo Nation in the American Southwest, in the top right, looking at the Mount Holly copper tailings pond in Canada, in Bristol Bay. In the bottom, at an abandoned coal mining town and copper mining town in South Greenland. And in the right at, basically lithium stockpiling and tailings ponds in the Atacama. And in the bottom left, I'll just say, I'll talk a bit more about Greenland, and I can talk endlessly about it if folks want to. But this is, it has a long and troubled history with colonialism and mining. Those mining towns are all the products of forced relocation. So Greenlanders being kicked out of one town, forced to live in another and work in the mines. And then when the mines are inevitably abandoned, so are the people. And this is a place now that no one lives. People go to take Instagram photos there. But of course, there are all kinds of, I think, really compelling. It's easy to go into one of these conversations and just focus on all of the bleak aspects of it. And sometimes I'm guilty of that. But there are all kinds of, I think, springs of hope here of incredible indigenous-led resistance efforts around the world. And I mentioned Greenland. One of those here is Urani Namik in the top left, means uranium no thanks in Greenlandic. Greenland is the largest contiguous indigenous nation on Earth. It's the largest island on Earth. It's the largest ice sheet outside of Antarctica on Earth. And it's also it's home to the second densest collection of rare earth elements and critical minerals on Earth after Bayan-Obo. And nevertheless, Urani Namik, as a group of activists, remain undefeated. They've turned back every mining operator eventually that they've ever encountered in the region. And I can say the same about lots of other folks you see on the screen here. And of course, those are extraction sites, wasting sites. These are the stockpiling sites. This is one outside of Perth in Western Australia. This is what a giant pile of lithium looks like, essentially. And of course, once it leaves that place, it goes to a place like this, which I'm going to play just a really short clip of this video, one of the new EV manufacturing facilities in the US that recently came online. So let me pause talking for a second to let this play.
114,000 Rivian customers are waiting for trucks and SUVs just like these, and many have sat on that wait list for more than a year.
Currently we're in body shop. This is R1 body shop that we're looking at right now.
The electric vehicle company is now burning through cash, rushing to fill those orders. It's a startup trying to prove it can build vehicles at scale without having ramped up before.
It definitely is a pressure that's felt. It's felt on the floor. It's felt by the entire team.
So what is the company doing to build faster? And can it become what investors want it to be, the Tesla of trucks, before its competition? I toured Rivian's plant and visited Ford's EV facility to find out. Rivian's factory in Normal, Illinois was previously home to Mitsubishi, which built cars here until 2015. Remnants of that facility, like a large part stamping machine, remain. But much of the plant and the process for making Rivian's three vehicles, the R1T, R1S, and Amazon-branded commercial van, are new. As is Tim Fallon, who was brought into Rivian in February after 16 years at Nissan.
What's job one right now?
Job one right now is I'll say, I don't want to say finishing the ramp, I'll say continuing the ramp and getting to stability.
Maybe define for us what stability means in a factory.
Stability to me is I want all of my team members, technicians to come in and see the exact same thing they saw yesterday, the parts in the same place, the right number of parts, everything running appropriately, and really being able to get into that rhythm and really do the dance of building vehicles.
That starts with stamping. From there,
so I could let this play much longer, but the only other thing I'll say there is that video pulls a couple things forward. One is the supply chain challenges that come from making electric vehicles, and one of the many reasons to think about modulating our demand for lithium by investing in other forms of transportation. The other is that, in the US, all of the incentives are stacked towards building the largest and buying the largest EV possible. So if you want the most generous tax credit as a small business owner in the US, you can't get it for buying a Prius, you can't get it for buying a Bolt, you can't get it for buying a Tesla, but you can get it for buying an electric Hummer, you can get it for buying an electric SUV. And so all of our incentives are stacked towards maximum lithium demand, and that's why we're on the resource-intensive transition pathway that we are now on. So just to continue a couple more quick examples here, this is the Ningxia Agrivoltaics project in northwestern China. This is, a piece of a complicated and troubled piece of infrastructure. It's trying to do a lot of things. It's trying to push back on creeping desertification in that part of China. It's trying to intervene in the food system. So this is why you see them, basically setting up row crops here. And it's trying to be an energy producer for the province, for Ningxia. And, is one kind of imperfect example of what this kind of world could look like if we go down, again, the most resource intensive pathway imaginable. And of course, again, I'm sure this is a topic you all have talked about. I know it is because I've seen some of the material. This is what an e-waste site looks like and the informal economy that is organized around it. And you go to a place like this in Ghana, you go to Zimbabwe, which has absolutely no rules about who can and who can dump what wherever they want to. And there's no sort of guidance or education from local or national officials about how to even deal with this material when you encounter it. There's all kinds of diseases of despair that are springing out of these things. And of course, I bring that forward. I bring all of these disparate sites forward for you just because this is a version of the image we get promised by folks who may not call themselves eco-modernist, but are, I think, pretty obviously eco-modernist. And this belief that we can sort of technologically solve every one of these problems in ways that create a win-win-win scenario for everyone. Obviously, that's not true. This is, even in this image off screen are the sites of extraction and waste disposal and processing that are not in the foreground here. So thinking about this energy transition is far more complicated and messy and dirty, actually, than images like this kind of lead us to believe. And again, I think to just talk about a couple of other quick examples here of what this could actually look like built into practice in the world. These are some of the kinds of projects that are at the core of one of my book projects I mentioned earlier, which is the same title of this talk, Building Just Post-Carbon Futures. That book's organized around 35 or so projects like these that are attempting to highlight, to document, to hold up as imperfect examples of the kind of world that Green New Dealers, climate justice advocates, and others want to build. In Canada, you probably know the way that Canadian government is thinking about implementing their Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So their attempt to basically think about ways to make or deliver reparations for colonization and genocide in Canada has been to build their energy transition and to hand the benefits of it over to First Nations and tribes. So one of the new rules for all of these federal energy projects in Canada is that 51% or more have to be owned by First Nations. You know, we could talk much more about that if you'd like to, but these are a few projects that came to me via someone named Douglas Robb, who's a now faculty member at the University of Calgary. He's an energy landscapes and decarbonization scholar, one of the most interesting folks in the field that I've ever met, and pulled some of these projects forward for me. So Tudeka geothermal, district energy and heat plant owned outright completely by 24 tribes in Canada. Same for that one in the bottom right there, transmission corridor owned outright by the tribal nations whose lands it intersects, and all the benefits that come from those projects then flow to those tribes in terms of, you know, financial and energy benefits. And then the other two that may have come up in conversation here the last few weeks as well. One of those is Orca, the sort of first large industrial scale carbon dioxide removal operation in the world. It's attached to the second largest geothermal plant in the world, which Iceland has you know, abundant resources for, and is now kind of being piloted in a few other places around the world as you know, a place. It's located in a place with abundant baseload power that allows it to be then a CDR sink. And then the other is an abandoned mining site in the Tennessee Valley, a former TVA-related coal mining site. This is one of the kind of dirty, not so secrets about the TVAs. It's one of the biggest coal and gas consumers in the U.S. As a utility. But one of their former coal mines, Raccoon Mountain, so a mountaintop removal site, you can see there, was converted into what's called a pumped hydro storage facility, or a very low-tech battery. So, you know, this is a site in which when it's powered by a mix of things, hydroelectric power from other dam sites, and then also wind turbines that are on the ridges throughout Appalachia. When the wind blows too much and they produce too much power that they can't use, it pumps water uphill into this reservoir to store it. And then when the wind inevitably dies down and there's not enough power for their consumers, they release the water, and it spins a turbine and works the same way that a battery farm would. But it reuses a toxic site and does it in ways that are far less materially and technologically invasive, which is interesting in a place like Appalachia for a lot of reasons, but primarily because it's a site where mountaintop removal is everywhere, and where the end uses for those mountaintop removal sites are about as bleak as you could imagine. They tend to exist in one of three forms. One is as sites of continued abandonment, so they're just mountaintop removal sites with nothing on them. A second is that they become monoculture savanna or grassland plantings that are then sort of left to be there on their own and become wildfire risks. The third is that these abandoned mines become prison facilities. So because they're flat sites, they're easy to build on. So that's one reason why prisons get built here. The second reason is that there are specific programs in the states, in Kentucky and West Virginia, Tennessee, and Pennsylvania, as well as federal grant and loan programs that explicitly send money to prison construction in these communities. And so they get built on the best building sites, which are the flattened mountaintop removal sites. And then the third is that you don't have to remediate those sites if you want to put incarcerated people on top of them. And so this is one of the afterlives for those sites. And I always like to include the Raccoon Mountain example in this conversation, because this is not a fait accompli. This is not the only way we can remediate or use these sites after they've been extracted in this way. And we're going to have to find other things besides prisons and grasslands and abandonment to do with them, because we have a lot. This is just as of 2019, so it's a little dated now. These are the active and speculative rare earth element and critical mineral mining sites around the world. This is kind of the geography of existing and aspirational extraction. And obviously there are many different mining sites within each of these dots, and they're all going to require, you know, the amount of these that we develop and actually extract from will depend on how we answer questions like how much lithium do we want, instead of how much lithium exists in the world. And then the other question of what we do with all of these sites after they're done will get answered by, I think, folks who are able to make a compelling argument about a site like Raccoon Mountain versus a site like USP McCreary, which are in the same region. They're both in Appalachia. They're both extant coal mines. One is a hydroelectric battery and one is a commercial facility. So, I'm going to talk really quickly here to begin to wrap us up about, this report, which I know has probably been broached a couple of times here over the last couple of weeks, but this is one I mentioned, for Thea, for us putting together, looking at a bunch of different sites in her set of new field work that's tied to a new book she's just wrapping up called Extraction. But again, tries to connect the conditions of the landscape, of the ore, of the people, of the politics in sites in Nevada, in Portugal, in Argentina, and in Chile, where lithium extraction is either already well underway or in the very quick ramp up to it in the case of Nevada. And in it, among many other things, pulls forward a couple of lessons that are really important to this conversation. One of which is just in the pull quote there, which is, the results of the modeling we did for this project demonstrate that both increasing the ease and availability of other forms of transportation and charging and changing EV design, so making them modular, can significantly influence cumulative demand for lithium-ion batteries and the lithium that's required to produce them. So in this report, we're talking a bit about demand-side extraction. We're talking a bit about enhanced recycling and reuse procedures, but often we're talking about specifications, in this case of the battery itself, right? Which is standard in most other industries to have a model or a universal specification for a piece of technology like this that's so integral to the functioning of the economy. But because we live in kind of a right-wing hellscape in the US, we don't do things like that. So we have this privileging of individuality and companies each having their own proprietary battery design, which is a problem for a million different reasons. But one of those is that it makes it impossible to really have any recyclability or reusability program work as intended in the lithium-ion battery industry. And of course, one of our goals at CCP is always to translate that research into actual sort of action. We've done that around public housing and transportation. I won't belabor the points on these reports, but these are things that were done kind of independent of, but then very quickly picked up by folks like Bernie Sanders and AOC, and in other cases, Jamal Bowman, Rashida Tlaib, Omar Ilhan, and others, to think about how we push cutting edge research like this into model legislation, and how that model legislation then gets carved up and inserted into things like the president's omnibus spending bill, or the next surface transportation reauthorization, or whatever other opportunity we get to really shape policy in this area. And that work shows up in a bunch of different ways for me in the center as well. I'm not going to spend a ton of time talking about this, but we've only been talking about renewable energy production here and the various nodes within it. We haven't talked a lot about the sort of movement of people. And a huge other component of this, in the US at least, is this competition for land that is coming, even in a land-rich country like the US. What you're looking at here, excuse me, is the existing energy sort of system of the US, at least as of 2018 in this case, or 2017. And what you're seeing are all the generation, transmission, and storage facilities, most of which are built entirely through unregulated private markets until the 60s. That's how most energy infrastructure was built in the US. To do this via a less dense energy source like wind or solar, or other forms of renewable energy, you have to build a version of this that's 2 or 3 times as large, because you need that much more generation and storage and transmission to make it work. And that's just, again, on the energy side. If we were to do all of that with just the generation with wind, this is kind of the volume of wind and the best areas to do it that way. It's kind of a silly exercise, but a way for us to emphasize just how land intensive these operations are. That's not even getting into the need to actually pull a bunch of the carbon that we've already put into the atmosphere out. That can be done through very small operations like the Orca project I mentioned in Iceland. The challenge for that is that those projects are incredibly capital intensive, and they also require massive amounts of energy to make them work. So you can build a carbon dioxide removal plant or project that's powered by a standalone, coal-fired power plant. And then at that point, what are you really doing if that's the way you want to power these things? So Iceland is lucky you can do it with abundant geothermal and hydroelectric baseload power. The US will have to develop new versions of that to build enough CDR capacity to pull any of that stuff out of the atmosphere. And in the meantime, that means because those operations are so difficult and expensive, that most folks have kind of thrown themselves into this fantasy that we can tree plant our way out of the climate crisis, right? That we can just plant enough trees and suck just enough carbon out, that we can then also reuse those trees to maybe build some CLT-based housing. There's this like lovely circular economy story we tell about it. The issue is that, one, again, the most land and water intensive operation imaginable is a tree planting plan around carbon sequestration. It's been disastrous as an intervention in other parts of the world for that reason. But the other is that these trees don't actually sequester carbon on a timescale that makes any sense for us. And you can go back, the number of reports that have been sort of produced now that have been auditing the offset forests that were built in the 80s and 90s and 2000s as ways for us to basically buy tax credits or carbon offset credits for ourselves when we jump on a plane or as a university want to lower our carbon footprint to get to net zero. What we found is that actually most of these offset forests only sequester about 40% or so of what was promised. So they're underperforming by 60 or so percent. And even the carbon they do sequester, most of it is in the biomass. It's not in the soil. So when you lose the tree, you chop it down, you burn it, you do other things with it, you re-release that carbon back in the atmosphere. So this is just a way of emphasizing like there's a lot of competition for land, and this is talking about all the people on the move. This is an image from a project called An Atlas for the Green New Deal we put out a few years ago. This image itself is looking at Matthew Hauer's work. Matt's a climate geographer based at Florida State, the first person to really count up the number of structures and then the number of people who will be literally underwater under the different sea level rise scenarios. So this is the most conservative map you could imagine. This is just how many houses and how many people will be literally underwater by 2100. It's not getting into how many places just upland from there will be uninhabitable because they flood so regularly or because so many people in their jurisdiction have had to leave that they're now financially insolvent. But Matt's the first one to go in and count all this up and then attach that to a demographic model to get a sense of where they might move. And again, because we live in a mostly unregulated housing market, it allows for people to move from one very flood-prone location to another. Also, by the way, those are sites where we're going to have to build new renewable energy capacity. So there's a lot. This is all a way around to saying there are lots of things on the move that matter in this conversation beyond just the extraction, beyond just the production, beyond just the wasting of technology and rare earths. And this shows up in lots of ways in the project I mentioned earlier, Field Notes Towards an Internationalist Green New Deal. I won't talk endlessly about this, but just to point folks towards it as a resource for thinking about all the different sort of nodes or topics that we're touching on here today that have a place in any conversation around what a just transition or climate justice could or should look like. And we play around with a bunch of weird little things in there trying to help people understand where bits of technology that are important to the sort of functioning of their everyday life, where they come from, how they get used, and what the consequences of pulling these things out of the ground can have. Because almost every rare earth element and almost every critical mineral that you would ever want for any piece of technology that's important to the energy or digital transition is almost always co-located with radioactive material, with uranium, with thorium, with things that have half-lives that are longer than humans have existed on this earth and probably will be existing in that form long after our species is gone. And just to begin to kind of wrap us up here, this work for me has been connected now to some other work I've done around extraction and exploitation in other parts of the US. So thinking about power generation, thinking about extant or erstwhile extraction efforts here has been a theme for me and my group here for a long time. In this case, a group of folks a few years ago and I looking at former plantation sites that have been converted into either fossil fuel generating facilities, so refineries, processing facilities, or to prisons. So if you look at Angola and Parchman, the two largest prison farms in the world, larger than the island of Manhattan, in Louisiana, Mississippi, they're former plantation sites. And like many former plantation sites that became prisons, the transition of those to state ownership came with the former plantation owner being the warden. That's where Parchman gets its name as the Mississippi State Penitentiary. He was the plantation owner and the first warden. And beyond that, beyond just the sites themselves, they are now also, as you surely know, sites of surplus labor for a bunch of different industries throughout the Gulf. Critically to this conversation, to the offshore oil and gas infrastructure of the Gulf. So, in the Gulf of Mexico, much of what you might see or encounter or otherwise know about there was either built or is still to this day maintained with convict leasing labor coming from one or more of these facilities. There's a robust sort of subsidy regime in place for building those things. I won't go into a ton of detail here on this, but again, this is partly about getting folks to think about our choices here, right? We have made very purposeful decisions to stand up this particular industry in a particular way, in a particular place. We're now making a similar set of decisions as a country on the rare earth extraction and processing side. And we don't have a great history, I think, of doing this kind of stuff well, and requires much more attention in order to do well and in limited capacities. I'm not going to talk a ton about this, but the last thing I'll say here to kind of begin to wrap us up is just to say a couple quick words about Greenland, which is a place that isn't on most people's radar unless they're interested in like polar bears or like National Geographic, I think, because it's often imagined by the public and in popular writing as an empty place, a place with ice, perhaps with ore, perhaps with fire, perhaps with charismatic megafauna, but not with people and not with places that matter. And, this is, as I said earlier, Greenland is the largest island on Earth. It is the largest contiguous community of indigenous peoples on Earth. It's about 60 or so thousand Inuit people who make up the population here, a couple thousand Danish folks who also work there, and a few other sort of folks from other places. And it's also home, as I said, to the second densest collection of rare earth elements in the world, and has a very long and troubled history with imperialism and colonial sort of practices around mining and extraction here. We can talk lots more about. But also one of the weird quirks of Greenland is South Greenland is kind of where I've spent most of my time. It's been around the Kvanefjeld mining site. This is a site that was a former uranium mine in the 1960s and 70s, used by the U.S. and European or U.S. and Denmark or Danish governments for their weapons and energy programs, and was decommissioned in the 1990s as the result of a bunch of organizing effort from a group of activists called Uranium, who I sort of mentioned earlier, who were able, over the course of about 20 years, to build enough power to win enough seats in parliament to pass a ban on uranium mining in Greenland. One of the first truly sort of acts of independence or sovereignty as they slowly build towards a truly sovereign state that's independent of Denmark, although they're still not there. And for 30 some odd years, that mine was essentially left abandoned above the town of Narsaq. But in 2014, a team of Danish geologists discovered the core samples here. They discovered the rare earth element deposits, and in very short order, the global mining community descended on this place and began applying for, and in some cases winning, exploration licenses to redevelop the mine and to use the town of 1,200 people or so's drinking water supply as the tailings pond. So there's a lake called Lake Tasik above Narsaq. That is where the company has proposed doing its or storing its tailings from this mine. And I've been involved in work there now for about 3.5 years. That's tied to thinking about alternatives to mining that could take that question off the table. So what are the other economic sort of investment opportunities or development opportunities that could make mining a moot sort of question here? So anyway, that you're seeing some little snippets of that. In the top left, the video you see kind of playing on a loop is at the port to a hydroelectric facility there called Korla Torsarock. Every town, so there are no roads in Greenland. Between towns, you get between places via boat and plane and snowmobile and dog sled and foot and kayak, depending on the season. And each town has its own standalone hydroelectric power plant, which is what we're visiting in this picture. We're in the valley where that hydroelectric facility operates. It's run by a gentleman named Otto, a Danish engineer who lives in total isolation. We were the first people he'd seen in about 18 months when we were there, and I don't know if or when he saw people after we left. And of course, this is, the group I mentioned, Uranium at one of their protests. This is 2016, so as the Kvanefjeld is being proposed for reopening, and you're seeing the town of Narsaq kind of on the right there, smeared in fog and rain last September, as we were kind of getting ready to depart to head back to the US. Just a quick little shot of that town. So I'm going to let that play for just 1 second so you get a little bit more of a visual. And then lastly, again, these are, thinking back to, I've mentioned this book project a couple of times. You've seen versions of these images a couple of times now. This is the CDR and geothermal plant in the top left in Iceland. I mentioned Orca and ON. The top right is a German project called First Pukler, It's part of their IBA program, which is its own really interesting post-extraction, post-carbon sort of national government program. We can talk more about if folks want. Bottom left is the transmission corridor I mentioned in Canada, and bottom right is the Raccoon Mountain project. Just to kind of end us here, because these are the questions that the book is organized around. These are some of the questions I think we may want to work through today, or at least take with us after today. But really, you know, this book is organized around those projects and then asking folks to respond in different ways to these questions. One of which is, what can we learn from prior eras of state-led, you know, investment or transformations in and of the built environment as our energy transition unfolds? What are things we might want to hold on to or find ways to adapt to the 21st century? And which is most other things, what other things do we want to just sort of discard and never reproduce in any form or fashion? And the New Deal is, you know, an interesting moment to think about that question. The second is and this is more of a domestic question, so for US sort of development, how do we begin to think through the tensions between this need for or desire for expedience and our hopeful commitment to practicing democracy? And by that I mean, how do we imagine being able to build the most stuff we've probably ever built as well and as fast as we've ever built it to meet all of the different benchmarks or timelines we've set for ourselves in a way that doesn't just flatten and steamroll people en route to building the energy transition? This is why folks in the US, when they talk about permitting reform, typically are just talking about deregulating land use to the point where you can build anything you want anywhere you want. And then the last question here, which is more internationalist in its orientation, is what might it mean for the rest of the world, for the West, to continue down its current energy transition pathway, which is the most material intensive pathway imaginable. That is the one we're on, and that requires, you know, if we continue down it, to basically strip mine places like South Greenland, like the Atacama, like Portugal, like Bonobo to the bedrock. Because there's no way to do anything else, where the only question that matters in those conversations is how much is there versus how much do we need. So with that, let me take my slides down and stop talking for a while and turn things back over to y'all. So thank you.